You are listening to the Bright Life Podcast, all about ways to stay inspired, chase your dreams, and find more gratitude in the highs and lows of the journey. I'm your host, Jessica Johnson. I'm a business owner, a part-time digital nomad, a self-growth junkie, a believer in other big-hearted women, and am all about sharing tips, tricks, lessons learned, and encouragement so we can all live our biggest, brightest lives. You ready? Let's do this. Hi, gorgeous. Today, I want to share some ideas around a fear that a lot of people have whenever they are bringing forth an idea in the world, whether that's to start a business, to write a book, to launch a podcast, or to just start a new chapter that is maybe something different and out of their comfort zone for either them or the people they know. And it's this feeling that our brains jump to of what's the worst case scenario? Like, what if the worst possible scenario happens? And I want to give you some workarounds for that because it's definitely something that my brain goes to as well. Anytime I'm putting out something that's really meaningful to me, I remember when I was writing my book, I had all these ideas around what if I get 1,000,000 one-star reviews and no one likes it and it's the worst book ever. And so I just want to share some really practical ideas for how you can navigate these thoughts around what if the worst case scenario happens when you're putting your dream and something that's close to you out into the world. All right. And so I hope that these really help you and that at the end of this episode, at the end of these 15 minutes, you will just feel like your mind is more at ease, you feel more confident putting your idea out into the world, and you have some tools to practically navigate those thoughts whenever they come up and kind of lovingly redirect your brain in the other direction, okay? So the first thing that has been really helpful for me is a little bit counterintuitive, but it's to play out what is the worst case scenario and what would you do if it happened. So for example, I mentioned with my book, I was so nervous because it's something that meant so much to me to put into the world. And I had this thought where I tried to follow and actually think through what would be like a worst case scenario. And so I imagined that this book got only one-star reviews, like tons of them. Like it was the worst reviewed book that Amazon had ever seen. And when I played that out, it was actually so surprisingly freeing to me because it allowed me to realize that even if that worst case scenario happened, I would still be, in this case, I was in the Mediterranean. I was starting off spring and summer in a place I loved. I felt so just lit up by where I was in the world and what I was doing. And I was like, you know what? Worst case scenario, I will be on an island in the Mediterranean with a bunch of reviews on my book that really don't even touch me. They don't even matter to my actual day-to-day life, right? And it allowed me in some twisted way to see the humor in it, where it's like the whole world could have this feeling about something that I'd done, and yet I would still be living a life that really brought me a lot of joy and fulfillment. Kind of reminds me, as I'm talking about it, of something I once heard Oprah say, where she was in this massive trial with the cow and meat industry after saying something about mad cow disease. And she just had mentioned that she remembers being on the trial and noticing that it was almost like this circus going on outside of her, and something that up until then had felt so aggressive and like people were attacking her and like this thing that she couldn't control, and it was becoming out like unwieldy in her life. She just looked around in a moment and just saw how none of it really actually could touch her. It felt like something outside of her and beyond her, and that gave her a little bit of a sense of control again, because she could just realize that she in her soul and in her body and herself, she was fine no matter what happened outside of her. So kind of something like that, where I would encourage you to think through, one, what is that worst case scenario for your situation? Like really think about it and call it out and name it. And then what would you do if that happened? Like, how would you be surviving and thriving potentially regardless? Would you get through it? And then I want to share a few other thoughts around that as well, if you're still feeling like, "Ooh, I don't know if I could survive it." So if that's the case, one thing that helps me to think about it and reframe it in a different way is to think through, okay, if this worst case scenario happened and it was more embarrassing or just worse than I ever could have fathomed, maybe in some way there's part of my soul that just wanted to learn this and wanted to go through that. Now, I'm not trying to minimize really, really hard traumatic situations at all, or in any way imply that you bring them on. But for me, we just had this episode last week around kind of thinking through, what could your soul be here to learn? Maybe that's part of why you're here, and giving yourself permission to just practice certain things as a beginner here on earth. And so for me, it's just kind of gives me a little bit of relief to think through, okay, even if this worst case scenario happened, maybe in some way, there's also a part of me that knows that I could handle it and that is going to get something out of it and is going to teach me something, and almost brought me to this scenario so that I could overcome it and go through it. So again, not trying to minimize anything or say that that applies to every scenario at all, but if it works for you, take it and feel free to borrow it for whatever your situation is that it does feel good and empowering around. Okay, another thing that I think about is, even if it's the most embarrassing thing ever, like someone doesn't like your book or your podcast or your business, or you get a bad review somewhere, you'll most likely survive, right? Like my mom has this great saying where if it doesn't matter for, in 5 years, if it won't matter, or you won't give 5 minutes to it of attention in 5 years, like don't stress about it now. And I think that that's sometimes a great one to apply to scenarios and just put it in perspective, where maybe it's consuming your mind right now, but in 5 years, if you're not even going to give 5 minutes of attention to it, it may not be worth the gravity that you are right now paying attention to it with, right? Okay, so that's another one. Another thing that helps me is to think through, okay, right now you're giving a lot of attention to the worst possible thing that could happen, right? But if you're gonna give that much attention to the worst possible scenario, why don't you also give some or equal attention to the best case scenario? So yes, there's the thought of what if the worst thing happens, but what if the best thing happens? And what is that instead? So maybe for my book, it's like, yes, I could have gotten 1,000,000 one-star reviews and I would have survived, and it would have been fine, and it would have been something that I could have learned and gone through and gotten a lot out of at a soul kind of learning level. But what was the best case scenario? The best case scenario is that I put this book into the world, which I really believe is a message that I love to share and believe in so much. It impacts the lives of hundreds or thousands or millions of women one day. It becomes a book that gets a ton of reviews from people leaving heartfelt messages of how it impacted them. It opens up doors and opportunities for me that I can't even see in this moment, that it just blooms into something even beyond itself, and it goes wherever it's meant to in the world. And on, and I could probably think of even more ideas around that, but that's just to illustrate ideas for you and your situation. So now you've thought through the worst case scenario that could happen, but give a few seconds to think through, what is the best case scenario that could happen instead? And then at least give as much attention to that, to whatever extent that you can, instead of just what the worst case scenario is. And you may find that your brain starts to anticipate really great opportunities and starts to get excited and re-energized around sharing this dream and idea in the world. There's a part of my book, Your Bright Life, which talks about the power of reframing your thoughts. So yes, you can have a belief maybe that someone won't like what you share, and that's fine. But one way to find a reframe in any situation is to ask yourself, what else could be true? So what else could be true? If you're afraid people won't like the message that you share, What else could be true? Maybe that people love what you share. Maybe they're inspired by it. Maybe they feel renewed hope because of it. Maybe they look forward to every time they see your message or your podcast online, or you starting a business. Maybe if you're afraid that it's not going to be successful, what else could be true? Maybe it could be wildly successful. Maybe it could open up opportunities that you can't even envision today. Maybe you'll be able to create financial independence for yourself or your family, location independence, like just creative fulfillment. You'll make a difference for every client that you serve. There's so many potentials that can happen and so many other things that could be true besides your worst fear and worst case scenario, that I hope that question allows you to really think through what else could be true, and chances are you'll find a lot of really great outcomes that could be true as well. Okay, so I hope that those give you some ideas for how to navigate the situation that so many creative people and big dreamers find themselves in, which is you're standing on this precipice of like launching your dream into the world, and you believe in it, and there's this feeling that you are meant to do this and you're meant for more, and you're right, you are, and this dream is meant to be in the world. And it's okay to have fear. Fear is not a stop sign. Fear doesn't mean you're doing something wrong or you should turn around. Oftentimes, fear just means this thing is really important to you and you're coming up against something you'll have to learn, a new way to navigate life. But often those are exactly the things that we need to learn the most in order to get to that next level and opportunity in our life. Okay, so again, if you have to think through your tools that will help you, think through what is the worst case scenario and how will you handle it? How will you survive? Remember that if you aren't going to give 5 minutes to it in 5 years, then don't be giving 5 hours to it now, right? Or 5 days or 5 months to it now, certainly. Think through, trust, believe in an empowering belief. Could be maybe there's some part of your soul that wants to learn this lesson and that can handle it, even if the worst case scenario happens, that you're built for this and you're feeling called to it for a reason. And if you're going to give attention to the worst case scenario, then make sure you're also giving it to thinking through what is the best case scenario here and paying some attention to that as well. All right, I believe in you. If you do share something into the world, make sure you let me know. I would honestly love to be one of your first supporters or reviewers or shares. I believe in you so much. I'm so grateful you're here, and I just can't wait for whatever you are bringing forth into the world. I'll see you again next week. Thank you so much for listening in. If you love this episode, there are 2 things that would be so helpful to me and this podcast. One, if you haven't yet, is to leave a review. These take less than a minute, but help get this podcast into the ears of more listeners and women it can uplift. Or if you've already left a review, share this episode on Instagram and tag me at @HiJessicaJohnson so I can personally thank you and reshare. Thank you for being here, and I will see you again next week.